Good day to everybody who's on the call. And I must say that was an inspirational presentation from Isabella, just really ramming home to us how important this whole issue of diversity and inclusivity is. I hope that UK, BSI and the global standards journey are really tackling this, and we as a standards community really have to take it straight on. All our committees need to reflect very sharply on what Isabella was saying. COVID-19 crisis, yes, this is a huge challenge, of course, and BSI is deeply involved in trying to support government, the public, industry in tackling it. There are two aspects that I might just tackle separately. The first aspect, of course, you'd expect me to talk about the standards. So we have, and indeed other countries have made a lot of standards available online for free download. We've done that. I'm pleased to report that today the standards from the BSI site have been downloaded over 56,000 times. So these are standards that people have asked for to help them understand, if they can, make ventilators, medical equipment, PPE, whatever, and try and help support the response. So that's a great thing. We've also run webinars, and we've had over 1,600 companies participating live in those webinars on resilience, on business continuity, on crisis management, and so on. So from a standards perspective, we published online guidance. It's all on the website. You can see how to access those standards. If you're a company, you can get access to those and use them. On the other side of the coin, on the assurance side, BSI Group is also a notified body in the area of PPE and medical devices. And so there's been a lot of work going on to support government in the approvals process for products that are being purchased. Obviously, the approvals of novel ventilator technology, but also PPE, particularly in the last few days. There's been a lot of that in the media around gowns, manufacture of gowns, manufacture of masks and visors. And we've published guidance online on that as well. That it's not straightforward, because in the area of frontline health workers, what might be a surgical gown to protect the patient has to become PPE to protect the wearer as well as the patient. So you have PPE and medical devices mixed up, and so there are a lot of very expert people thinking through that in some depth. Also, a lot of challenge that there are very well-meaning companies and individuals trying to manufacture things, yes, but please, a lot of guidance and standards that we do need to meet to make sure that what we give to frontline workers is actually safe, because the last thing we want to do is to purchase and deploy PPE for frontline health workers, or indeed for the public, which is actually putting them at more risk than they would be if they were not protected and knew they were not protected. So there's a lot of areas that we're trying to help, David, and I'm very happy to take any other questions on that.
Yeah. The question and answer session is open. So we've got on the call, I think it's a 50-50 split between between committee members, so people who are involved in the standards development process, and those who are standards users. On the standards development side, Scott, we are still writing standards.
Oh yes, I mean, in fact, the production of standards is hardly diminished. Committees now meeting online, they're meeting virtually for obvious reasons. That's been agreed and decided not just in BSI, but at the international and European regional levels. So in ISO and IEC and CEN and CENELEC, or ETSI, all of these committees are now happening online. So our fifth floor meeting rooms are empty, deserted, and although some meetings have been postponed, an awful lot are happening online, and the publication schedule is proceeding pretty much as it was before. And we may find that this is a solution that we can continue with in a post-COVID-19 era.
Yeah, and indeed, Gordon Ferguson's just come on and said that he held a BSI committee meeting to review a BSI and ISO standard yesterday online on WebEx, and it was very effective and efficient. So they could well be
certainly also been. I mean, all the governance meetings obviously have switched as well, and that's been reviewed on a monthly basis within ISO. In my role as Vice President Policy of ISO, we have a sort of 3-month rolling window, and we've just pushed that out yet another month into the summer.
And maybe just the last one on that. Obviously, once this first phase of the crisis is over, there's a whole other question about economic recovery. Do you want to touch a little bit on BSI's role in that?
Well, I think that we are reflecting internally as to how best we can support the global economy, how to support British manufacturers, British industry, the public in a post-COVID era. I think there are some very interesting angles to that. Globalization, the kind of recognition that we're all in this together. Actually, that's really come home to roost. I mean, I appreciate people have comments about other countries and so on, but actually, when you get down to it, we're all in this together. If you want to manufacture something, and you need a common standard. So we think very clearly that there's a massive role for international standards to help global recovery and to increase the productivity of companies around the world as they try to pick themselves up again after this. There may also be a big avenue of interest around regional activity, regional economies, and regionalization, but again supported by standards that allow you to be very flexible in your supply chain management. So if companies are seeking to become more resilient in future and reduce their dependency on a single supply chain, then the ability to switch easily from one supplier to another, from one country to another, may well be part of the future recovery model. And to do that, they will need standards.
Yeah. Sarah asks about the fact that so many meetings have been successfully managed online. Do you see a sea change in how meetings are run in the future?
I think we probably will see more agility in terms of perhaps running more meetings online, more regular dialogue. I have to say that I'd like to be really sure that our chairs of meetings and our meeting practices were adapted to ensure the kind of engagement and participation that Isabella was talking about. I mean, it's hard enough in a room of people to ensure that the quieter people participate and you're not dominated by the big voices. It's very difficult online, as we're discovering even today, to have a really interactive conversation. So I think that meeting practice may need to be looked at, but I'm sure that this ability to participate virtually will bring a far bigger audience to bear on standards development, and that itself, for me, outweighs some of the risks. The ability to engage a huge community in a consensus building process seems to me at the heart of what BSI stands for.
Yeah, and Mark Barsby confirms that the recent committee he attended 50% increase in attendance virtually compared to face-to-face, and we've seen that with this event as well.
Yeah.
A question from Paul about with the global crisis, process standards offer an opportunity. Should you think there's a global standard for global pandemics? Well,
yes. I mean, pandemics have been on everybody's risk register for a long time, along with meteor impact and the kind of consideration that the point of a pandemic affects everybody, and we will kind of know it when we get there. So yes, I mean, in terms of business continuity, crisis management, there's lots there already. When you're talking pandemic, you're talking of issues that are clearly impacting everybody, your competitors, your suppliers, your customers, your governments, and the whole geographical impact. So where there are standards there, I would argue we're very much around the ability to be flexible and responsive. The ability, for example, as many companies have had to learn rather quickly, to work out of the office, to work virtually, and to switch quite rapidly. And we may see that over some months and indeed possibly years ahead, where there are interruptions and people have to revert to other modes of working quite quickly. So I would think best practices in that area should be shared. I think there's lots of opportunity to do that. I think there's actually very good opportunity, that's the first point, very good opportunity to bundle standards of good practice to support companies in increasing their productivity and recovering their markets as fast as possible. And I think there's thirdly, very good practice to be shared to help employers demonstrate that they are following whatever distancing measures are applied in their locality, and to prove that they are really trying to be better than the minimum in terms of building trust with their employees and getting back to work. So I think there's some quite new work to be done quite urgently that will help employers demonstrate to their employees and their local authorities and communities that they are being trusted to operate within the government guidelines and go beyond that as good employers.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly going to be some new topics coming out, and there was a suggestion from Adrian about standards for insurance companies around pandemics. There could be some need for regulations there, so there'll be a whole host of new topics. Zoom, do you want to say anything about Zoom? Because obviously that's the ISO and BSI, the tool that ISO is using around the world. Zoom has had its security challenges recently.
Yes, it has, and we've heard about that, and it was raised by the Vice President Technical of ISO, Sao-Kuk Choi from Singapore, about a month ago. ISO as an organization has been looking into this in some detail, and certainly Zoom recognizes the deficiencies that have been raised, or some of them, and are addressing those. So from an ISO and IEC standards making perspective, as a client of Zoom, Zoom have agreed to make whatever patches they have to make to address some of those issues. So that's as far as I know where we stand today with Zoom.
And Gordon corrects me, we still use WebEx, of course, in BSI. Let's just, moving on from COVID, the other topic that's been much in our minds over the past few years or so, the UK outside of the EU, there's going to be changes to the way standards are used in the UK. There's a session this afternoon, and we've had a question in already from Tony about BSI's future international cooperation, specifically with Sensenelec after 2020. So there's a session for everyone this afternoon on that. Do you want to say a little about that, Scott?
Yeah, we've got to have a detailed session on this afternoon with our colleagues led by Richard Collin. But in a nutshell, our ambition as UK post-transition global trading nation, global player, is to be using international standards throughout our British Standards collection. So for that, we look to our stakeholders to tell us what they want, and they say universally that they want to be participating in the international standard system. They want maximum influence possible that we can engineer in the international and European regional standard systems. So we know also from our European colleagues in the Sensenelec family that they value the UK voice very much. So what we have to do now is to agree a membership arrangements with Sensenelec in the long term that will provide the maximum influence for the UK stakeholders that we can achieve. And we have every confidence that that is going to take place. What we have to do is to respect that in a post-transition UK environment, there will be UK national regulation and there will be, in the European environment, European regulation. So our standards, which are common to both environments, will need to serve two regulatory systems. And BSI, therefore, as its primary duty, needs to serve Her Majesty's government and provide a national standards collection that is coherent, consistent, and will be effectively used by government to support British regulation in whichever sector those standards are relevant, and at the same time to participate in the international standard system so that we can be as confident as possible that those standards are used in a common economic environment in the European region and globally. So we are full members of Sensenelec. That continues. In the nuts and bolts of this, there is an agreement amongst the Sensenelec members that we have a derogation on the wording of the statutes to the end of December 2021, during which time, or if we achieve it earlier, we achieve it earlier. We work out what the detailed arrangements for UK's long-term membership will be. I don't see that as being a huge issue. We just need to ensure we've dotted the I's and crossed the T's.
Great. And the ISO and IEC work continues there. We're hosting the ISO annual general meeting, the ISO week next year, hoping everything's back to normal by then. But that's a great opportunity for the UK. Yes,
the ISO and IEC memberships, of course, are completely unaffected by the UK exit from the European Union. And that work continues as before. We are delighted to be hosting the ISO General Assembly, which we plan to do in London in September 2021. We are optimistic that whatever COVID-19 does to us in the next few months, we will continue planning and host that event next September. And we look to all of you to recognise that. That'll be the first time that the UK has hosted the ISO General Assembly for 25 years, David, is that right?
Yeah.
And a huge opportunity if we're moving into a post-COVID environment to celebrate the UK's role in the international standards community. We plan to host it in the centre of London. And of course, at the Institution of Civil Engineers, we will have a reception, which was indeed the building where the United Nations meeting was held in 1946 that led to the foundation of ISO. So here we are going right back to the roots of the UK's commitment to international standards next year.
Great. We've got about 10 minutes left, so if you've got a question for Scott about BSI's policies or about the work BSI is doing right now, it's not too late to submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom. We've had a question about gender participation in committees and whether BSI and ISO keeps data on gender participation. I think that is something that we're moving towards in BSI, but I know that the Standards Policy and Strategy Committee, that sort of top level committee of BSI's committee, they're looking really closely at this.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And this whole question of data protection and privacy has national implications. There are countries that are very particular about the privacy of their citizens. So capturing that data and aggregating it globally is extremely difficult. And then there are countries that are more open, and there are ways to do this. And we are certainly doing everything we can, because I think it's extremely important that we do capture and monitor in an anonymized way information about the diversity of our standards communities. It's a fundamental principle of the work in international standards that we are representing all stakeholders, that all stakeholders have a voice. So we need to demonstrate that all stakeholders have had the chance and have had their voices not just expressed, but actually heard and listened to, and that the outputs reflect those inputs. So we need to do more on this, and it's something I'd like to really change quite rapidly. Over the last few years, we have stepped our way into the process, encouraging chairs of committees to look at the makeup of their committee. I think this year we've got some very specific projects to really make a step change in how we're doing this. But I think that monitoring the diversity of our committee processes is really very fundamental to that. So we have ways of trying to tackle that, but we are starting from a low base. Historically, we didn't collect such information. Now we need to. We've got many thousands of experts who participate in standards development work, and asking them questions is something that we're just going to have to do, and hopefully people will voluntarily participate in that process because they recognize the importance of it.
Yeah. A few questions coming in about post-EU exit and what it means. A question from Jim about there could be an issue for current UK CEN-TC chairman, so the chairman of European committees, to continue if their standards are to be harmonised in a directive. I mean, that's not the case at the moment. Isn't that right, Scott? That there could be an issue with our current TC chairs.
That there should be no issue with our current TC chairs, and I'm hopeful that we will work out an arrangement by which that will continue. We don't see an issue. The point is that our standards that our committees make together and cooperatively are important industry-facing documents, market-led, stakeholder-driven documents in their own right. The fact that authorities, whether in the European Commission or in Her Majesty's government, choose to use those industry standards as a tool to support the delivery of regulatory policy is a separate matter. And I remember a very distinguished German colleague in CEN and CENELEC describing this and saying, look, we don't want to wait for the citation of standards to support regulation. The document is useful to industry immediately. So we're just going to use it right now. So I think that with that kind of attitude, if we think of the vast bulk of our work in the European regional space as being simply market-led, industry-driven standards 80, maybe nearly 90% now, but certainly 85% of our work is purely B2B industry-led standards, and only 10, 15, 20% maximum are being used by the authorities to support the delivery of regulatory policy. So that's the handshake between industry, the marketplace, the stakeholders, and regulators, and that's the piece that we need to watch out for. But I think that, again, the whole point here is that from an industry stakeholder perspective, from the consumer perspective, from the environmental perspective, what we want to achieve is one common standard that is used everywhere, even if there is a regulatory divergence, big or small, in different geographic territories. And we have experience of that within the United Kingdom, and there's certainly plenty of experience of that even across Europe today. It is not a perfect system, and indeed part of its success is it's got a wriggle room. So you'll see within the United Kingdom, and we use this example quite frequently, that building regulations are different in Scotland and England and Wales, Northern Ireland, but the standards are the same. So we can find lots of ways to explain why there's a very obvious logic that we continue to participate in all of this international standards work, even if regulators in different territories decide to use them in slightly different ways.
Yeah, and of course, Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland Protocol is another wrinkle in that.
Yeah, and we've been having very interesting discussions just in the last few weeks with colleagues in Northern Ireland to discuss with them their position, their understanding, and to get their viewpoints as a stakeholder, really critical stakeholder actually, in the whole process as they try to balance off manufacturing, particularly manufacturing, as an example in Northern Ireland, balance off the obligations under the agreements towards the European Union and indeed towards the United Kingdom at the same time. There's a very obvious example why standards have to be common, even if regulatory requirements are or diverge at some point in the future.
Yeah. A few questions about digitization. Roland asks about moving beyond static PDF files as the means of publishing standards. And there's a question about the use of AI in standard setting, and also whether digitization of standards will help enterprises to get involved in using and embedding standards in the future. There's a lot going on in BSI right now around digitalization.
Yeah, there is. And it's a great question, Roland. Thank you very much. I mean, this can't happen fast enough for me, that's for sure. And I have to say that Shirley Bailey-Wood and her team in BSI have made huge steps forward. And there's a great story to be told here about which standards and how we can adapt the style of the content, the codification of the material itself, and to anticipate that within a few years, there will be quite a chunk of the British Standards Catalogue which is entirely code, perhaps with some human readable interpretation, and that is purposefully driven directly into the workflow of organizations that choose to use those standards. So we start to see standards that are designed to be incorporated in the workflow of organizations, just as apps on your device are invisible to you, and you just use them. So I think that's really the great step forwards. Of course, it's been opened up through digital manufacturing and all the conversations around Industry 4.0 and supply chains and so on. But actually, I think we should see it, and certainly from our UK strengths, we should see that as a bigger, wider opportunity to start thinking about the digitalization, not just of the process of making the standards, which we're already doing, but through the actual output itself and how that directly allows the interaction between the user of the standard and the feedback loop into the improvement and further evolution of the document. So we have an expert in our team, Ivan Salcido, who I'm just always a pleasure to hear him talking about this, who's just 24/7 on this process of understanding how we reinvent the traditional paper concept of a standard, even its PDF interpretation, into a completely different world. So that is happening right now, and if anyone has specific areas they would like us to look at, I would be more than delighted to hear of specific case studies, examples of where people would like to see that kind of work piloted.
Yeah, because we've had questions about how BSI is able to align new standards development at the same pace with new technology. So that speaks a lot to the need for agile standards.
Yeah, I mean, to that, David, I just rehearse that in fact, I was on a session this morning trying to describe this briefly, that people know us as the traditional full-on international British standards process, 3 months open public consultation and on all of that, and people assert that takes time. Well, it does take time because you've got an awful lot of people involved in countries. And then we have the PAS process that's been a very successful tool, and I'm really celebrating the publication today of PAS 440, the Responsible Innovation PAS. Is so exciting because we've talked about that for years, but we've finally got around to publishing it. And the PAS process is a sort of fast track process, but it's maintaining the attributes of the formal standards development cycle. But now we also have an agile process, and we've used that on autonomous vehicles, and we're going to use it now this year on the new standards for competence in the built environment that follow the Dame Judith Hackett's Grenfell report. And this is a much more digitally driven type of cycle where we can really work with iterations that are happening within weeks, and then we're trialing it in practice and then feeding back and so on. So this allows us to have 3 streams, 3 tools, if you like, of consensus building for our stakeholder community, and we can choose which tools we need to use in consultation with the stakeholders so we can develop a strategy that leads to the output we need in the time that we have.
Great. Lots of final questions coming in that we don't have time to take in detail, but lots of questions inspired by the presentation from Isabella about how we can take forward issues like writing a standard that deals with clinical trials, writing a standard around data bias. All of these ideas were put into the process.
Yeah, I saw some of those very excellent points about clinical trials, and the whole question of digital health has been talked about for some years, and what's the role of standards in that space, and how do you manage the data issues and so on. And I would really be delighted if we could make some big steps forward there. But as always, our role at BSI is to support you stakeholders. You say you need it, our job is to facilitate it. So we just need to have that community of interest, that community of driving the request, the ask, and wanting to use the outcome. It's not that we want to sit here in BSI thinking of new things to standardize. What we want is to hear from you, and then if there's sufficient interest, and then we'll just take that forward.
That's great, Scott. That brings our e-conference to a close. What do you think? We should do it again sometime.
Well, I think it's been a great success, and I mean, it was very interesting in some of the breakout sessions. I mean, I enjoyed that. It's quite an intimate style of people talking to each other, and I think we need to adapt some of our approaches slightly, but I think it's been very useful. And if we can reach a big audience in this process, then I think it must be very helpful. So yes, I've enjoyed it. It's been very interesting. Thank you very much to Stephanie, particularly, I think, but you too, David, for hosting us.
Thank you. And we will, of course, send out a feedback form for you so you can tell us what you thought of it and where we can do better next time. Although this is the end of the morning session, there is still 2 special focus sessions this afternoon. Now's a chance to go grab some lunch. You can meet with our exhibitors again in the Knowledge Marketplace. They'll be working right through the lunch break using the links on the agenda that you received to join their exhibitions and to talk to them about the things that's on their minds. Our next session will be 2 special sessions, one on organizational resilience, the other on standards, trade and regulatory policy post-EU exit. They'll both start at 1:30, be hosted by my colleagues. I hope to see as many of you as there as possible. And in closing, for your participation, thank you for working with us through the technical challenges that we have, as always with these things. We look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully, who knows, with a face-to-face meeting.
Good.
Thanks,
David. Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you, everybody.